Hello, everyone tuning in, and thank you so much for joining us on this community table talk. Today, we will be discussing racial disparity in housing, specifically within our Indigenous community. So today, I am joined by two very special guests. We have Hollee George and Lou Roberts. So would you mind introducing yourselves?
Hi, Bonjour, Lou Roberts, Nandinjikas, Name Nedodam, Kenora Ndunjaba, and Kitchener Andayan. So I introduced myself in the language. I am originally from Kenora, Ontario, although my band is Sandy Lake in Ontario. My mom is a residential school survivor, so she got taken from her community when she was very young and never really went back to the community and grew up in Kenora. And I am currently the Indigenous Justice Coordinator at Waterloo Region Community Legal Services. I help Indigenous clients, people, and as well as doing community development work. I help in areas of landlord-tenant, tenant concerns at the LTB, as well as social assistance, including OW and ODSP. Miigwech.
Awesome. Bonjour, Vasco Gijigo Kwe Dijnagas Namada Dem Ajadena Dondaba Parawami Ojukwe Nishmari. What I've just now said to you is hello. My name is Red Sky Woman. I belong to the Sturgeon clan. I'm a band member to the Chippewas of Kettleton Stony Point First Nation, which is between Sarnia and London, but I do live and work here on the Haldeman Tract. I'm a Potawatomi Ojibwe Two-Spirit woman, which means I'm a lesbian, so I'm part of the rainbow community. I've been recently brought on board with the Social Development Center to build an eviction prevention program for the cities of KW. And we do have a particular focus on Indigenous and 2S LGBTQ, BIPOC, available to all people, certainly, but our focus is 2S LGBTQ, BIPOC, low-income newcomers. And I think it's a great and wonderful thing that we're filling some gaps in service.
Absolutely. Thank you both for those introductions. And before we begin, I'd also like to place myself in this conversation. I am a ancestor of uninvited European settlers to Turtle Island. I approach this conversation in best intentions, in hopes of learning and understanding more about the racial disparity in housing and more about the Indigenous culture. I do also offer a land acknowledgement and say that the land on which I host this from today, which is Waterloo Region, is a land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. I also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. So for some folks who have watched multiple segments of Community Table Talk, they might notice that I do a land acknowledgement before we begin any questions for any segments. So I'm hoping we can have just a brief discussion around what land acknowledgements mean and why they're important.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle, for providing that. And land acknowledgements have gained in popularity for a while now. But one of the things that I'd like to emphasize as a land acknowledgement is I see it as a starting off point. It's not something that should be just recited and then forgotten about. And so it's something to be used as a tool and to move farther, I guess, more towards a call to action, as opposed to saying, you know, just the words of the traditional territory or land acknowledgement.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with Lou, that land acknowledgements are a tool and they are a first step. But when you're an Indigenous person who's out there listening in that environment, watching, listening, feeling those words and those land acknowledgements, it needs to come from a place of sincerity. It needs to come from a place of action. And too many times do we see scripted, prescribed, scripted, whatever word that you want to call it, people standing there reading the paper. And for me, as an Indigenous person, it feels really superficial. So put the paper down, learn it, say it, love it, mean it from your heart. You know, don't stand there with the piece of paper.
And I also wanted to mention, because you had mentioned it, Hollee, of being on the Haldeman Tract and the Haldeman Treaty. Oh.
She has babies.
They'll make a cameo at some point, I'm sure. You are muted.
Oh.
Sorry about that. Yeah, one of my kids, they're learning from home, so sometimes there's little interruptions. All right, so as I was saying, Hollee had mentioned the Haldeman Tract and the Haldeman Treaty, and I think it's really important, even myself, I'm a visitor to this area because I'm originally from Northern Ontario, and so I think it's really important to learn what those treaties mean that you're living on. You might have this a little bit later, but I'll show you a couple of the things that I have here. So for those of you that may or may not know this, this is the two-row wampum. So it's it's part of the treaty that is in this area, one of the first treaties between settlers and the people Indigenous to this area. I also have another one that predates as well. So this is the One Dish and One Spoon Treaty. And this was a treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people, meaning so one dish and one spoon to share the resources together, and not using sharp instruments, and just using the spoon to share those resources. So I have those. But it's important to learn about why we do these things and what the importance is of the treaties, for example, or why we are, like, Indigenous people are here on the land, and the land is used to, you know, there's not a lot, like the ownership of land is not really thought of as ownership, for example. So it's more of that sharing of resources. So when treaties were created, sometimes, and a lot of times, they were created with a lot of, I guess, different languages, maybe misled into beliefs of, you know, ownership as opposed to the sharing of the resources.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up with that, using the two-row wampum as an example, that depicts the river of life, the relationship between Indigenous people, and I was going to talk about this, so I'm glad you brought up sooner than later. You know, it depicts, you know, us as brothers, as the settler nation and Indigenous people traveling along this river of life together. And the interpretation of that treaty is, you know, we're brothers, we're family. And we do so in the spirit of partnership and cooperation.
It's also, like the teachings I've learned too, it's also meant to show that, you know, there's no crossing and interfering, I suppose, with each other's governance systems. So going down together on the path or the river of life together without any interference.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow, thank you both so much. I mean, like you said, Hollee, it's easy to read a script, but to dive more into the history and the meaning of the words that you're saying is so important, not only for reconciliation, just for understanding the land that you are now benefiting from and working on and serving on. And, you know, it really puts things into perspective once you start learning more about it truly. So I'd like to kind of launch us out into the housing world. When we start looking at the racial disparity in housing, we're noticing that a lot of folks from the Indigenous community are disproportionately impacted by homelessness or lack of suitable housing. You know, why is that the case? Why are Indigenous folks so disproportionately impacted?
Because we're the first people to be displaced or dispossessed or evicted in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talking of, like I mentioned a little bit earlier about the treaties, and you know, the treaties haven't been honored, or the treaties have been coerced oftentimes, right? So the fact that even if you look at the historical factors, you know, the creation of reserves were meant to push Indigenous peoples into a small area of land. Oftentimes that area of land was considered to be barren or not useful. The pass system, right, that was used a while ago, you know, still within our historical knowledge, but you know, Indigenous people weren't allowed to leave the reserve without having a pass, the Indian agent. So all of those policies from the beginning of colonization that has occurred continues, and it continues even to this day.
Mm-hmm. Well, we consider North America, Turtle Island, as our traditional territory, as our original place of being. And so with colonization, obviously then our traditional territory of North America gets substantially reduced through colonial boundaries, you know, Canada, the United States, the provinces, and it continues to shrink. So we once had something that was so big and so grand and so available in terms of resources, and colonization and settlers have squeezed us into small Indian reserves. Now, there's a difference between traditional territory and Indian reserves. And traditional territory is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, though the treaties exist, they're not being honored. The reserve boundaries are even much more smaller. And I think what people don't know and understand is that because of the creation of those systems, much of the Indian bands cannot support their fast growing membership. There is no opportunity on the reserves. There's no opportunity for housing. I am a displaced urban Indigenous person. Even if I wanted to go back home, where? There's no land, there's nothing being developed, there's no housing, there's no opportunity, there's no jobs, you know? So, and as Canada's, as a nation continues to grow and people come in and they settle, it's squeezing us into smaller and smaller spaces. And the urban Indigenous population, you know, we're in the concrete jungle. We need access to green space. We need access to, you know, choice. We need choice. Because as of right now, I don't have a choice. I can't go back to my community because there's nothing there. And that is the story of many.
Same with me. Like I said earlier, my mom's a residential school survivor. Sandy Lake is a fly-in community in Northern Ontario. So she was sent to Kenora to go to the residential school. But, you know, once attending the residential school, she lost her ability to speak her language. She lost a lot of the culture. So going home is going to be foreign now, right? There's going to be a lot of displacement. So I never grew up knowing my culture, my language. I, you know, moved into this urbanized space, and you know, with a lot of those colonial issues, a lot of the people I interact with face those same oppressions, subject to things like other things, you know, I said residential school, but like 60 scoop, even the millennial scoop. So it's still happening now. There's CAS or FNCS involvement. And, you know, a lot of the kids in care are aging out of foster homes, and there's no supports available to them. So how are they supposed to, you know, find proper housing? Compounded with, you know, the lack of affordable housing, you know, things like OW and ODSP do not meet those needs. Often Hollee said too, you know, bands only have so much resources available, but also, you know, the Indian Act has also caused a lot, like there's gender disparities in the Indian Act as well, right? So a lot of people have lost their status and lost their home communities, so they can't even access those resources.
Yeah, I think that's an important part to know and understand, is that the Indian reserves that were created by the Canadian government are so substantially small compared to pre-colonization. And we're one of the fastest growing populations here in Canada. Where are we supposed to go? We are outgrowing those boundaries. So that is why you see a number of people leaving the boundaries of the reserve, because there's no space, there's no opportunity, it feels foreign. And I want to speak to Two-Spirit people. The impact of colonization on reserve, well, a lot of places, has been homophobia and transphobia. Many Indigenous people, Two-Spirit people, don't feel safe to go back to their First Nation community because homophobia and transphobia are deeply, deeply rooted in the community. Many urban Indigenous people leave the confines of the reserve seeking opportunity. But when they get here, it's a culture shock. They don't know people, they don't, you know, it's multicultural, they're trying to find community, they're trying to find themselves. It's just a whole backpack full of things that we come with to the city and to these, and we put it in the context of housing and evictions. You know, there are many other systems that have said it is indisputable, it's generally accepted that Indigenous people have experienced this, that, and the other. These are the impacts of colonization. We see it in the criminal justice system, we see it in the family system, we're seeing it in the community legal system, we're seeing it in a number of places. If these impacts of colonization are generally accepted and indisputable, why are we not considering alternatives to eviction? Why are we not considering alternatives to helping keep the people? We need to provide sustainability for the people, because we are the original displaced people.
Oftentimes too, I get inquiries about, you know, housing and access to housing, and there's obviously there's stereotypes, right, that the mainstream society thinks of Indigenous people, you know. And so when somebody is applying for housing too and they get denied, you know, there's reasons, or, you know, that landlords may say, oh, we don't rent to you people, you know. I've heard that before, not myself, but from other people that have said, you know, like when Indigenous people are disproportionately overrepresented in a lot of the things that Hollee said, like, you know, social assistance. You know, a lot of landlords will, even though they can't discriminate, they still do, you know, based on income. So if they're on ODSP or OW, you know, they may say something like, oh, we're not going to rent to you because your credit score is too low, or you make too little money, or, you know, just the stereotypes. Oh, you know, there's going to be drugs and alcohol, or, you know, something to that effect. Just those preconceived stereotypes that that even have a barrier even before getting your foot in the door, right? Never mind the getting to, you know, an eviction, because, you know, if you can't get in, you know, and that happens, it happens more than you'd think, I think.
Mm-hmm. And just a point about not being able to get in, super important to bring out at this time. When we don't have opportunity to safe and affordable housing as Two-Spirit people, and I want to speak and frame it from that context, when we don't have safe and affordable housing, then we don't have choice. And the only choice then we see is to be in those unsafe, unhealthy, abusive partnerships or relationships, cohabitations, If I want to be a single lesbian in this community and live alone, I should have a choice in that. I don't want to feel like I should partner up with somebody so that I can, you know, make ends meet. I don't want to be in an unsafe environment. I don't want to be in an unhealthy environment. I want something that's going to be safe, affordable, just for me, if that's what I so choose. And that's just me. I can imagine, and that's what people need is options. Options. Indigenous people generally, and particularly because we have the overrepresentation, like Lou said, overrepresentation in the jails, in the prisons, in the social assistance systems, child welfare, all of these systems. We need housing that is cooperative, supportive, transitional, all of those good things. Save seats even, something that designates specifically for us if we don't have something that's Indigenous specific, I would say. Save space, hold space. Because we're coming with a whole backpack of issue on top of issue on top of issue and on top of issue. Even the Supreme Court of Canada, in a criminal context, said the impacts of colonization, such as poverty and substance abuse and racism and all of these things, are generally accepted and indisputable. Why are we not recognizing those factors in these systems? You cannot make decisions with and for Indigenous people unless you consider those things.
Absolutely. And I think that just as a point, as someone who is not identifying as Indigenous, if you are listening to this and you're getting uncomfortable, then good, because you're learning. And I would encourage anybody watching to look into the re-traumatization and traumatization and ongoing oppression of Indigenous folks in our community, because that's how we learn. And unfortunately, we don't have enough time today to unpack it all. And I don't know if we ever would, because we have generations of trauma and displacement history. But I would really, really encourage folks to look into this, because that is the only way that we can break cycle, is if we understand how we got here in the first place.
I'd also like to add too, right? Like a lot of people say, you know, it's in the past, or, you know, it happened a long time ago. Well, no, it didn't. It's not in the past. It's still currently happening. It's still currently, these issues are still ongoing. I hear this quote all the time, but you know, and it's true. Like there are more children in care now than there ever was in residential school. So you know, the children in care, or even the prison system, is just essentially a new residential school, the new way to continue that colonization or even genocide of Indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm. Read the Indian Act. Everybody's hearing about, you know, the calls to action, the calls to justice. Read the Indian Act. There is no other people that are governed in this way but Indian people.
Mm-hmm. In the world.
We are heavily legislated.
Absolutely. So if we have housing providers now that are hearing you and they want to be allies and they want to do better, what cultural consideration should be given to Indigenous folks in housing, and how do we as housing providers or people in this position of power ally ourselves appropriately with the Indigenous community?
Do you want to go with that, Lou, first?
Sure.
Before
Yeah,
you lose the thought I saw in your eyes.
well, yeah, so even as an ally, just amplifying those voices, taking that step back, because we know what's best for us. Don't lead. Another thing too, I think is really important is not using a cookie cutter approach or a viewpoint. Not all Indigenous people are the same. The Haudenosaunee are very different from the Anishinaabe and are very different from Cree people. So knowing what territory, whose territory you're in, is super important. You know, there's the three First Nation, Métis and Inuit. Make sure you know what the difference is. Making sure that the needs, you know, are relevant to the group or groups that you're working with. and yeah, educate yourself.
Talk to people, invite them in. We're not so scary. You know, involve the hereditary chiefs and councils, involve the Indian Act elected chiefs and councils, involve the people in the community. We want to talk about it just but you, but somebody has, I am tired of talking. I want to see our people. If we're acknowledging the land and the people's land, where are the people at the table? Not just locally, you know, grassroots and all the way, it has to be all the way up. We need the people at the table. So, you know, find out where the Indigenous people are. Where are the leadership? Where are the Two-Spirit people? Because they're here. And it's a point that I want to drive home as an Indigenous Two-Spirit woman. It's not safe for us to go back to the reserves. Because how many times have we heard, you Indians go back to the reserve? Well, even if I wanted to, there's no space and it's not safe for me. So what I have to do is basically, because this is not my, you know, the Haldeman tract, I'm a settler here too. I've been dispossessed from my traditional homelands into somebody else's homelands. I'm very aware of that, even as an Indigenous person. So there's some, you know, it's not just, as much as I want to be home, there's no home to go to. And the concept of urban, Indigenous, we're houseless. Have you heard that, Lou? Houseless, homeless, the difference between that? No one understands the difference. And when you're providing, holding space for Indigenous people, when you're talking to Indigenous people, think and speak and act in a way that is holistic. And if there's one thing I can say is, when we have these overrepresentations in all of these systems, it does not make sense that you would develop policy or law or what have you that would create or further the impacts of colonization. If it's generally accepted that these are the situations and circumstances, facts and circumstances of Indigenous experience in Canada, why are we not considering those each and every time we make a decision with and for about Indigenous people? You cannot create or further those things that have already impacted us, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And I like when you're saying houseless. I mean, the other part of this is when Indigenous folks are trying to make the house that they have a home, there are also other barriers that they may face. You know, smudging in the unit or in a building is a big one. I'm just hoping that someone can briefly touch on that before we talk about some resources.
We need green space. All the climate justice warriors, hear me on this. We need green space. Our cultural and spiritual identity as Indigenous people depends on green space. We need access to the land. The land provides so much. And we are all responsible for being good stewards of the land. Who we are and our connection requires green space. And urban development is doing this to our identity and our green space.
Sorry, I think I froze there for a second. Do you mind just, I know Lou, you were talking, do you mind repeating that, your thought about the smudging in the unit? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so I got a little distracted, so I just wanted to make sure I heard correctly, but just thinking about like smudging or any like practices that are, they're protected, right, under human rights. So, I mean, if it comes to where there's smudging occurring inside of a unit, like a rented unit, we have every right to do that, and it's protected. So if there's a landlord that says, no, you can't do this, well, you can, and you can cite the Human Rights Act under that cultural affiliation, and just make sure that, you know, I guess that education part is key, right? Because there may not be a lot of people who know how to express that. You know, there's a lot of distrust around authority and that fear around, oh, if I'm going to fight this, you know, or if I'm going to say this to my landlord, I'm so worried about being evicted. But just making sure that you know, there's access to those available resources. You know, I can definitely provide that support for somebody if they have a conflict with their landlord and are having questions around those human rights violations. And so, you know, there's a lot of those supports around here, like myself. There's the Human Rights Legal Support Center, Hollee, right? So we're all here to help and make sure that, you know, there's education around all of this.
And just a practical tip to anybody out there, cannabis and sage are often mistaken. Is it not, Lou?
Yeah, I don't understand why they
often complain that the smell of sage smells like cannabis.
I don't understand why do we have different smells, so I'm not sure why, but yes, I've heard that so many times. And it's just, I think it's just ignorance, right? That whole ignorance around, you know, smudging and whatnot. But definitely, it's within our human rights to be able to practice our ceremonies, our traditions, and cultures.
Right. And just to further that, you know, the elders have taught me, because I'm an urban Indigenous woman, because I grew up in the concrete jungle, you know, it's, and I might as well throw this two-spirit in there, being a two-spirit Indigenous person, you know, I'm heavily displaced from my community for so many reasons, right? So you think about that, I'm brown, I'm a woman, I'm gay, you know, I'm already displaced. I'm not at this time struggling with mental health or addictions or anything, and nobody wakes up aspiring to live with an addiction. But many of our people are out there and they can't find the green space, they can't find the service, they can't find the support because everything is critically underfunded. Critically underfunded. And it doesn't matter if it's on reserve, off reserve.
Huge. That's a huge, huge barrier, is that lack of funding and the lack of available resources.
So then let's have that conversation about what resources are available. So there's a tenant or a member or just a community member that's really seeking out Indigenous-specific cultural supports. What can housing providers or, you know, other agents in the community, who can they refer them to?
What I was taught by my elders is that we don't need to always go to a lodge per se to have a relationship with the creator and whatnot, but we do need access to green space. No matter how small, we can still honor that land and that connection to the land. And that's why in the concrete jungle here, it's important to preserve as much green space as possible. You know, not just because it looks nice and it's good for the earth, but because from an Indigenous perspective, our connection to the land is significant. Our whole way of being, and similar to, you know, my grandfather once said, you know, you don't need a brick and mortar church to have a relationship with Jesus. It's kind of the same thing. I don't need to go to an actual lodge, but to have my relationship with the creator. But I do need a little bit of land. I need green space. I need something. Yeah.
Land and water.
Yeah. Right. You know, I can do ceremony, you know, in my house, out in the backyard, you know, anywhere, but it has to be there. That green space. I just can't impress that enough, is access to the land.
There is one thing I wanted to mention in regards to the conversation we had about like funding and resources available. I also wanted to mention though too, you know, there are people that are status and non-status, you know, there's Métis and Inuit, and there's different categories and groups. And, you know, when there's funding available or the resources that are available, oftentimes the funding is very narrow in that, you know, only certain people can apply for it. So like, for example, if you need a status card, well, that just, you know, it's, you can't even look at, you know, what's available for the non-status people. And there are so many based off of, you know, like the Indian Act and, you know, the disparities, the gender disparities of the Indian Act, where people have lost their status. So there's so much of that kind of thing that's happening where people don't even meet the requirements of what is available. And it's just so specific and so narrow that it only helps like a small portion of people. So I think that's an issue as well. So we have to be mindful too of, you know, when we're creating something or if we're asking, you know, for funding, to make sure that, you know, that's considered, and who is benefiting from it, who's not benefiting from it, how can we make it more inclusive?
Absolutely correct, yeah.
Are there those inclusive agencies and community in Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge that serve both status and non-status Indigenous folks?
Yeah. So in instances of housing, like you'd have to find out, so there is a housing provider called KW Urban Native Wigwam Project. You'd have to find out though what their criteria is. I'm not too sure. But for myself, like I'll assist anybody who self-identifies. There may be certain programs, like we have a GLADU project that we've done, you know, that might be only specific to certain people. Certain people who have been impacted by that. So it just depends, right? But yes, I will help. I'll serve anybody who self-identifies.
The Social Development Center Waterloo Region Eviction Prevention Program has myself handling KW and my counterpart Michelle handling Cambridge. Now, again, we are able to support all tenants who need it, though we do have a focus on 2S LGBTQ, BIPOC, newcomer, and refugee immigrant folks who are coming to the region, to these cities. But we do have the Indigenous support services that we do have, I think, all operate on a self-identification basis. That's how their doors are open to anybody. And I want to make a point about that though too, is one thing that we are finding, and I think it's an important point, Lou, that we can bring up, is self-identification as an Indigenous person is helpful in providing that bridge of inclusivity that the Indian Act basically tells us who belongs, who's Indian and who's not, and who belongs and who doesn't. So that self-identification, that self-identification process tries to, you know, bridge that gap. However, people abuse it, and it needs to be said. People identify as Indigenous people thinking it's faster, it's better, it's get out of jail free, it's get this, you know what I mean? There's a ton of abuse of self-identification as being an Indigenous person. So I think we can't have this conversation without saying that too.
I also wanted to mention though too, that whole self-identification, like it's based on what Hollee is saying, like it's based on misinformation though, right? Like if we talk about like the criminalization, there's GLADU reports or like the Indigenous Peoples Courts, and somebody thinking, oh, if I self-identify, it'll be that get out of jail free card, which it totally isn't. It really isn't. It's just, we have to keep educating and making sure that, you know, there's that information out there that, you know, this is actually what it is. This is what it's for. This is who it's supposed to benefit and how. And, you know, yeah, it's true. There are people that will try and, you know, do whatever to try and get, you know, funding or something, right, to that effect. But it's just you kind of have to make sure that, you know, there's that education and combating those stereotypes. You know, I pay taxes. you know, Indigenous people pay taxes. That's another one. We
Property
don't
taxes, yeah.
education, right? That it's those silly things that people have these preconceived notions for that just, it really doesn't, you know, happen. And again, there's those narrow criteria for certain things, right? Like taxes. Yeah, there's some that people don't pay on reserve certain things, but it's just those myths, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I think there's just so much misinformation. There's so many assumptions that people are making about Indigenous folks that it's just, sometimes it's a little bit of a romanticized view of the benefits, and that intergenerational trauma and that ongoing you know, identity concerns and displacement concerns are just kind of pushed to the side. But I did want to highlight that there are a few organizations and community in addition to your own that have been helpful, at least in my experience, in getting folks support. And that's those are agencies like Healing of the Seven Generations, White Owl Ancestry, there's the Crow Shield Lodge, there's, you know, a couple other ones out there. Is there anybody I'm missing that's in the region?
Well, one important point is Wellbeing Waterloo does have an Indigenous working group, which Lou and I are on in that working group. So that's great.
They list, I believe they list the organizations there. So if you, I think there might be a site where they would list it, or if you get on their email list.
Great. What I can do is actually try to find that list, and then I can post a link to that in the description of the YouTube video.
Perfect.
But I do see that our time together is winding down. So Hollee, Lou, thank you so much for sharing your information, your wisdom, your insights, and your personal experiences. I think it's been eye-opening, at least for myself, and hopefully for anybody watching as well.
Wonderful. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. Take care.